Hello, how you doing? It's Phil Thatch. I hope you're doing well, and today I want to talk to you about the first lens you should buy for your Canon R7 or maybe your Canon R10. And I did a first lens you should buy video a couple years ago for the Nikon Z50, and I really believed in the lens that I recommended, but it didn't work for everybody. So this time around, instead of giving you just one lens, I'm going to give you lots of lenses for various different types of photography. So we're going to start out with the best all-around lens to get for your Canon R7. And I truly think this is the very first lens you should get for your R7, and it's the kit lens. If you buy this with your camera, it's $100 cheaper or $99 cheaper. It's the 18 to 150 RFS lens, and it is fantastic. Look how small it is. It's really small, it's really light, it's discreet, and it has a great range. Full frame equivalent is 28.8 to 240 millimeters. It's really sharp. It's great for street photography. It's great for landscape photography. It's great for mild macro. You can do some portraits with it. It's not going to have a really blurry background, but it will have a fairly blurry if you zoom all the way to 150 and make a headshot. You can make a blurry background that way. I think this lens is worth it. I think it's worth the extra money to get this lens because it's such a great little lens. All right, now we're going to get into some specific genres. We're going to start with portrait photography. We're going to start at maybe not my very best area, but a lot of people are very interested in portrait photography, and the serious professional portrait photographer is probably using a full frame camera with a 85 millimeter, a fast 85 millimeter prime, probably a 1.4 or a 1.2, maybe at worst a 1.8. Well, we are probably not going to be buying that lens for this camera, because if you're going to spend $3,000 and get an 85 1.2, you're probably not on this camera. But if you want to make some portraits with this camera, I recommend the nifty 50. This is the RF 50 millimeter f1.8, and on this camera, which has a crop factor of 1.6, so you multiply 50 times 1.6 and you get 80. So it's just about 85. It's fast, it's a 1.8, so it'll give you a nice blurry background. Not as blurry as an 85 1.2 would on full frame, but pretty blurry. Your pictures will look fairly professional with this lens on this camera. And you can get this lens for 199 bucks. Right now, as I make this video, it's actually on sale a little cheaper than that, but even at 199, it's still pretty cheap for a lens, especially one that can give you some pretty amazing results like this one can. Okay, next up is my favorite genre of photography, and that is wildlife. And my number one recommendation for wildlife, although you can do some wildlife, some larger wildlife you could do with this lens, but you can do a lot more with this lens, and this lens is so inexpensive. It's a $649 lens that's a 100 to 400 millimeter telephoto zoom. It's nice and sharp. It's not super fast. It's f8 on the long end, so you'll need to be careful in low light, but you can make some great photographs of larger wildlife like deer or kangaroo, stuff like that with this lens. And even on the long end, you can do some bird photography, some small bird photography. You can definitely do large bird photography like heron or osprey, but you can even do photography of small birds with this if you can get fairly close. It has a 160 to 640 millimeter full frame equivalent. Now, speaking of full frame, this lens is the 100 to 500, and if you're on a full frame camera, this lens is 100 to 500, and it costs nearly $3,000. But on this APS-C camera, this lens, which costs $649, is full frame equivalent 160 to 640. So with this camera and this lens, you have better reach than an expensive full frame camera and this crazy expensive lens. So that's something to think about. Now, Like I said, this lens might not be the very best for small birds. For me, I like even more than 640 millimeters full frame equivalent for small birds. So one day you can start out with this lens, and maybe if you fall absolutely in love with small bird photography, then you can go ahead and get this lens. And this lens on this camera is 160 to 800 full frame equivalent. So this lens, when I used it on my R6, my full frame camera, I rarely use this for bird photography. I used something else. But on this camera, I use this lens because it has enough reach on this R7. And it's sharper than the lens I was using. What lens was I using? I was using this. This is the RF 800 millimeter f11 lens, and it on full frame is 800 millimeters like this is on APS-C. But when you put this on APS-C, it's 1,280 millimeters full frame equivalent. Now, I don't recommend this all the time, but if your subject is a small bird and it's 30 feet away, this is your best bet at filling the frame, and you can fill it on this camera because it's 1,280 millimeters full frame equivalent. This lens is $999. Right now it's on sale for a little less, but $999 is the regular price. And while I don't recommend it as your first lens, I guess I'm talking more than just your first lens in the wildlife segment because it's near and dear to my heart. But you can move to this one. There's also a 600 millimeter f11 that's a couple $100 cheaper that you can consider. But for me, your first one should be this one, the RF 100 to 400. And if you decide you want to really go further and spend a lot more money, get the 100 to 500 and maybe even this 800. Okay, next we're going to talk about sports photography. And I have probably more than one recommendation for that too, because there's a lot of different kinds of sports photography. If you're photographing outdoor sports, whether it's your kid's little league team or soccer or football, something like that, let's go back to that 100 to 400. It's super inexpensive, it's super sharp, great range, not good in low light. So if your sports photography gets to be kind of an after dark, under the lights outdoor affair, then it's going to cost you a little bit. Then I recommend you move up to the 70 to 200. This is the 70 to 200 2.8. Mine looks different than a stock one. They come with a big white lens hood and I put on a smaller black one. This lens is fantastic. That's the good news. The bad news, it's almost $3,000. So don't buy this one unless you really need low light. But if you do need low light, you pretty much have to have this one. It gives you a 320 millimeter full frame equivalent. You can shoot your baseball or your soccer, football at night with this lens. Now, if you're doing indoor, I don't think 2.8 is fast enough for indoor, especially if it's like a high school basketball gymnasium or volleyball inside. I don't think 2.8 is fast enough. This camera's not great at high ISO, which means it's not great in low light when you still need a fast shutter speed. And so with that in mind, you probably will want to go with a prime lens. You could use the 50 millimeter 1.8 that we talked about for portraits. That'll get your shutter speed up without raising your ISO too much when you're in a dark gymnasium. They also have, looks similar to this, they also have a 35 millimeter 1.8. It's $499. If you need a little bit wider lens than this 80 millimeter full frame equivalent, that one's $56. They have a 24 millimeter 1.8 if you need even wider. Just depends on how close you are to the action. And I think the best place to be is in the very front row, even sitting on the floor of the gymnasium if you can. With that in mind, you might use the 24, the 35, or this 50, because they're going to let in enough light to do sports with this camera indoors. For landscape photography, it's hard to beat the kit lens. Now, you know, for landscape photography, you're pretty much always shooting at f8 or f11. So you don't need an expensive fast lens. And because a lot of times for landscape photography, you're making a picture of maybe a waterfall, and to get the right angle on that thing, you've got to get yourself right at the edge of a cliff. You can't move forward, you can't move backwards. Having a zoom lens is really helpful in landscape photography. So I don't recommend primes for landscape. My number one choice is this lens. It's 18 to 150, the kit lens. That's 28.8 to 240. Great range. One problem. If you need ultra wide, this lens won't get you there. And I've heard some YouTubers say, oh, there's no ultra wide choices for the Canon RFS. Oh no, you just won't be able to shoot ultra wide. Guess again, you can get this lens right here. This is the EFS, not RF, but EFS 10 to 18, which is 16 to 28.8. It's light as a feather, small, sharp, especially at f8 and f11, where you want to shoot for landscape photography. I bought mine for $200, including tax, used. You can get them brand new for $299, and then the EF to RF adapter is 99 bucks. And you put that on there and you've got 16 full frame equivalent all the way to 240. That right there is all you need. That's your entire landscape photography kit right there. Small, light, sharp, dependable. What's not to love? So for landscape, the EFS 10 to 18 and the RFS 18 to 150. Next, we're going to talk about macro photography. Now, this lens has a 0.44 to 1 maximum magnification. So this lens is actually pretty good for mild macro. If your macro subject is not really small, like if it's a butterfly sized subject, the kit lens does great. Another good lower dollar macro lens is this one. The 100 to 400 has a 0.41 to 1 magnification, and it can do butterflies and things like that, but it can do it from a little further back than this one can. So these two, if you're just shooting like flowers or butterflies, things of that size, these two work great. There's also the 35 1.8, which is a little more magnification than these. It's 0.5 to 1, where this is 0.41 and this is 0.44. So almost the same. And that's the 35 for $499 is 0.5, and there's an 85 f2, which is 0.5. Those are so little more than this one, I'd recommend just sticking with this instead of going to those two. But if you want serious macro photography from your R7, then you're going to have to spend a little bit more money. And then I recommend getting the RF 100mm f2.8 macro. Unfortunately, it's $13.99. Right now it's on sale for less than that, but the regular price is $13.99. But it's hard to beat this lens. It is fantastic. Now, another way to go that will give you even more magnification than this and is cheaper, there's a company called Laowa, and they make manual focus macro lenses that'll hook right up to your camera. They don't send any data to the camera, so you won't be able to remember your settings. But if you want to do manual focus, they make an 85 5.6. It's about the same size as this kit lens, and it's 2 to 1 macro. Dynamite. If you don't need autofocus, that might be a way to go without spending as much as you would on this. But my number one recommendation for this camera for macro, unfortunately it's expensive, it's the RF 100mm 2.8 macro. All right, next we're going to talk about street photography. And street photography is anybody's game. You know what I mean? You can use ultra wide lenses for street photography. You can use super telephotos for street photography. You can use anything in between. Street photography is very creative, and there's not one style or type of lens that is best for street photography. Now, some purists say that you have to use a prime lens. You can't have a zoom if you're doing street photography. I think those people are a little cuckoo, but if you're into that, if you want to go with just a prime, some lenses that I've already mentioned would be great. The 35mm 1.8 prime is $499. It's a 56mm full frame equivalent. This 50mm is $199. It's an 80mm full frame equivalent. They have a 24, it's a little pricier at $599, and it is 38.4mm full frame equivalent. And they have a 16, it's a 16 2.8, and it is 25.6mm full frame equivalent. Now, for me, instead of any of those primes, I'd use this. This thing's 28.8 all the way to 240 and everywhere in between, and it's all in one lens. It doesn't make any sense to me. Now, if you want to separate your subject from the background, which to me is not street photography. Street photography, you can see the subject and the background is also in focus. If the background is way out of focus, then it's more of a portrait. And then you go with something like this. But a lot of people that shoot street photography with a prime don't do it wide open. They shoot at f8. But if you're going to shoot at f8, you might as well use this. And then you've got a 28.8 prime, a 29 prime, a 31 prime. You got all these primes because it does it all. So great lens, very discreet, you know. It doesn't look like you're walking around with this, taking pictures of people from 4 miles away. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You can do street photography with this lens, whatever you want. Street photography is very freeing. But for me, the street photography lens is this lens, the kit lens, the 18-150. Okay, our next and final genre is astrophotography. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the R7 is not a great astrophotography camera. For astrophotography, you pretty much need a camera that does really well at high ISO. And while you can run some software on the files that come out of this camera and have them look pretty good at high ISO, you can run that same software on cameras that are great at high ISO, and in the end, those are going to be better. But if you want to do astrophotography with this, probably the 16mm 2.8 or the 24mm 1.8 would be the best choices. But for me, this is not an astrophotography camera. Go get you an R6 or even an EOS R or even an RP, one of those full frame cameras that does a little bit better at high ISO than this camera. This camera's biggest strength is its reach, so it's great for wildlife, and its biggest weakness is high ISO, so it's not good for astro or low light. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Canon not letting third-party manufacturers develop autofocus lenses for the RF mount, and while I do agree that that is kind of a bummer, it would be nice for me personally to have the option to buy a Tamron lens or something like that. I've never personally ever bought one. I shot Nikon for years and I could have bought Tamron all during that time. Never bought a single Tamron lens. I did buy a couple of Tokina lenses that I really liked, and I even have some Viltrox lenses for some of my Nikon cameras. But Canon makes lenses that have an L on them and a red stripe that are extremely expensive, but they also make lenses without the L and without the red stripe, like these and this one, that are not very expensive. So you don't have to have a third-party manufacturer to help you. There's plenty of budget options that are really great made by Canon. Okay, so let's summarize. For portrait photography, my choice is the nifty 50, the RF 50mm 1.8 for $199. For wildlife, my first choice is the RF 100-400, which is $649. It's on sale for a little less right now. For sports photography, outdoors, the RF 100-400, and if it's outdoor sports after dark under the lights, the expensive 70-200 2.8. And for indoor sports, I recommend the 35 1.8 or the 50 1.8 or the 24 1.8 lenses. For landscape photography, I recommend the adapted EFS 10-18 with a $99 adapter in conjunction with the kit lens, the 18-150. For macro photography, my number one choice, unfortunately it's not inexpensive, is the RF 100mm. And for a budget lens that's even more magnification, the Laowa 85 5.6. Or if you don't need really up close macro, the kit lens does great with its 0.4 4:1 magnification. Street photography, my choice is the kit lens. The 18-150 is great for street photography. You can also get some of those primes, the 24, the 35, or the 50, depending on what you like best. And what you can do is shoot with this lens for a while and see if you really want to go with a prime. Start out with this, make a lot of shots, see what focal length you're using the most if you want to prime. And then buy that one, whether it's the 50, the 24, or the 35. Last but not least is astrophotography, and for that I recommend a full frame camera, a different camera than this one. I recommend the RP or the EOS R or the R6 would be a better choice than this camera. If Astro is your number one thing, I don't think the R7 is the right camera for you. But for basically everything else, especially wildlife and macro, the R7 is the way to go. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day. If you like this content, give me a thumbs up, and if you want to see some more, subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye.